Hi, welcome to episode 26 of METACO Talks. This is our series of live conversations with the people at the forefront of innovation around decentralized finance. Today, the title of the episode is Reappraising the Role of Bitcoin. And to discuss this, we have a very special guest, Izabella Kaminska, editor of FT Alphaville. Just give a little background. Before that, she worked as a producer at CNBC, was a natural gas reporter at Platts, and associate editor of BP's internal magazine. She's also worked as a reporter on English language business papers in Poland, Azerbaijan, and was a Reuters graduate trainee in 2004. Izabella, great to have you here on METACO Talk.
Thanks for having me. Some of those achievements were very long ago.
Well, yeah, impressive nonetheless. But listen, I think this is great to reconnect. We were on a roundtable discussion in April where we talked about the investability of Bitcoin. So I think to a degree, there's a little bit of a similar sort of theme, and how the market and you, I guess, are reappraising that.
Yeah, absolutely. Go on.
So maybe to kick things off, I mean, it's so interesting that, you're a writer, the current role writer at FT. FT is often characterized as being a little bit hostile to crypto, which is not the case, from our last discussion that we had. So I'd be very, very keen to hear, your own personal journey, how your views have evolved around Bitcoin.
So I don't think it's fair to say, so a lot of people sort of say, oh, Alphaville is trash talks and, we're haters. I don't think that's actually fair. I think, or that we are biased, because I think sometimes it's missed that we are equally harsh on everybody. So there is there is a sort of like, I would say, a misperception that we are specifically harsh on crypto when, we came out of the, GFC being incredibly harsh about the conventional system and about banks. We're not a sort of voice that is saying crypto bad, conventional system good, by no stretch of the imagination. I think what we are pragmatists, and certainly my perspective has always been one of cynicism, because it was a fanciful creation. It had an incredibly larger than life, ambition to take down the standing system. And as a sort of, committed pragmatist, I think I'm always cynical of the idea that systems can evolve in ways that don't descend back to the path of least resistance. And I'll turn that off. And the path of in finance, the path of least resistance is always centralization. It's always the creation of trusted intermediaries, because that is just simply the configuration of how finance operates. And so I guess my cynicism has always been centered on this idea that to assume that Bitcoin has solved this problem is a very big expectation. I think over the years, our kind of general perspective has very much been actually, I would say, confirmed, because remember what we were saying is that Bitcoin's not going to suddenly decentralize finance. In fact, it's created, I would argue, as big an opportunity for new trusted intermediaries as there ever was, and that's the kind of ironic cyclical approach. I'm always about, the life cycle of a fintech is that you eventually become the thing that you were trying to disrupt, right? And that's really my perspective. Now, where it has changed in the last year, and I think for me personally, and this is just a personal perspective, is that I was, whilst I was very cynical about the standing system and very aware of its problems, in terms of the GFC, the fragility, the potential in a lot of cases for fraud, I still very much trusted that we live in a very democratic, I trust the government, right? That is basically where I'm coming from. And I think with the pandemic, it's not that I don't trust the government, it's just that I have been quite shocked at how quickly social norms can change. And I never really appreciated how quickly that can happen. And whilst I'm not sitting here saying I don't trust the government at all, I do think it has alerted me to the fact that Bitcoin does solve a problem, which is in the event that I never thought that our democratic systems would be fragile to the degree that, and I now think maybe they are. And I think that is fundamentally what changed. I think in that environment, Bitcoin does solve a problem, which is that when you have no alternative way to fund yourself because all the systems are controlled by a potentially corrupt government, I do think that it solves a problem. And of course, you can't create that system when the corruption is already there. It has to be preemptive. And so now I'm future-proofing. Like, I understand the point of the future-proofing is what I'm saying. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think it's great context. And I think many of us have had that journey basically from trust to at least questioning, whether we distrust or not, at least having the option, the escape route potentially. I mean, gold's always formed that to a degree, and now I think people look at Bitcoin. But so with that context in mind, what do you think the role of Bitcoin is? Or maybe just expand a bit more, what do you think the role of Bitcoin is within capital markets as you see it?
So I think, in a hypothesis where, say, and this is a hypothesis, where there has been a massive sort of mispricing of the market, say, just hypothetically, because central bankers have been, let's use the conventional Bitcoin, cliche, that central bankers have like overdone it a bit. I think in that sort of world, it is useful to have a secondary asset that you can sort of do comparative price valuations against. And it's a hedge. And I'm not convinced it's necessarily going to be the sort of hedge that responds, the way people think it will. I don't suppose it's, I think that's one of the things about gold actually, is that people think gold is very kind of like anti-cyclical or, like a VIX type product. But actually gold, when you look at the historical record, it doesn't necessarily always behave as you think it would. And even in an inflationary environment, what gold represents is a store of value, a last resort that can be liquidated when you really, really need it. And I think that's one of the reasons why actually often in a crisis, gold goes down before it goes up. So when you really need the liquidity, you cash out of gold. And I think with Bitcoin, it might be similar, but it's that final resort, that final kind of like reserve of liquidity that you wouldn't otherwise spend. And I think that serves, that's not to say the value will always be protected in there, but I think it does offer a sort of swing balancing sort of pool of liquidity that can be thrown at a sort of tight liquidity situation that is now kind of compartmentalized and out of, we've never been in this situation before. So like in the GFC, when we ran out of liquidity, there wasn't a kind of third pool of liquidity that you could just tap. And now there is this sort of like pool of crypto, and it will be interesting to see what happens if, everywhere else gets tight. Will people start liquidating the crypto, or will it be a flight to safety? I'm not sure how it will operate. I think it'll probably be a mix of two. The people who are distressed will liquidate, and those who are worried will flood. It might balance itself off, but it offers a sort of alternative tool in that sort of scenario. And I do think institutions now, whether they like it or not, whether they believe in it or not, it's now probably impossible for them to ignore it. And that's going to change things, because the more they come into it and the more they legitimize it effectively, the more it will become a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that it will behave that way.
I mean, I think that dilemma you talked about, liquidity versus, the money of last resort, are potentially, it's more a time horizon question. I mean, I think more than anything, because everything goes down, as you say, the most liquid things go down first because that's what you can raise money with. But longer term, liquidity can be a function of what the central bank does, right, and how they respond. And excess liquidity can drive a longer term holdings and movement into that asset that's less limited. I mean, maybe touch a little bit on some comments. Is Bitcoin, in that, expanding a bit, is Bitcoin, do you think, potentially a good form of money? I mean, I've seen you've posted on this in the past, so I'd love to hear a bit more color on that. I'm
actually, in terms of money, that's the least sort of like, I see it more as a sort of alternative asset, or I see it as a sort of useful mechanism to balance and anchor different fiat systems. So I think it's sort of, pre-Bitcoin and I guess post-gold, post Bretton Woods, you've had all these different floating currencies or non-floating currency systems, right? And it's hard to compare and contrast because there isn't a universal anchor against you. You've got the SDR, but there isn't an anchor that you can price all these different systems, these different fiat systems against, the sort of relative benchmark, right? And Bitcoin kind of, because it's fundamentally anchored to the cost of energy, it provides that ability for different fiat systems to kind of compare themselves to Bitcoin. And that is really where the potential, I think, is. I think on the ground, when it comes to kind of day-to-day transactions, there's just too much sort of legacy, commitment to the old, obviously we had the euro come in and trash a load of like local currencies. But that was like under mandate. That was, that would take
political movement. Yeah.
Incredible kind of buy-in from the political classes. And Bitcoin by nature it can't do that sort of top-down mandated thing, because that would be hypocritical of what it stands for. And to have buy-in from the bottom up, I think that would be really hard. People will always default to the local currencies, and they understand, they think in those. Numeraire is fundamental. But I think there is a place for Bitcoin in the sort of, it sounds, I know that Bitcoin's people defend from this, but the one transaction market it really does operate in is obviously the black market. I know it's not just, I agree actually with people who say the black market transactions are not the be all and end all of Bitcoin. I agree with that, but it is also the case that it is one of the areas where it does get transacted in as an actual money tool. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I think now of like, authoritarian regimes under, the USSR or whatever, there was always a vibrant dollar market, because in an authoritarian system, you need a secondary sort of non-controlled money system. And I think in emerging markets or places where there is no trust or buy-in in terms of the government, that's not a bad thing, because the black market, isn't all just drugs and criminal activity. In an authoritarian country, it can be like the market for repressed press, or the market for like repressed goods, or for like legitimate things that are about resistance to those authoritarian states. So and I that's where I think the transactional potential is. But I don't think it matters actually that the fiat world, I think the two can coexist. I don't think it's one or the other. And I think actually the system works better when there are challenges to each other. And so the consumer can always, they have a choice, and they go, sometimes you need the resilience and stability of fiat and a kind of controlled and managed currency. And if you trust your government, I really don't see the problem with fiat. Other times you don't, and you need Bitcoin. The best option is to have both.
100% agree. I think it's often overlooked that most of the world, we take it for granted that we have, you're in the UK, I'm in Switzerland, that we have a working financial system, working banking system, and we can relatively trust the government. Many countries don't have that. So I think that's often missed as a core view, that there needs to be an alternative, or it's very helpful to have an alternative. Now, in the context of alternatives, gold, and I think, let's say gold 2.0 or Bitcoin is sometimes described it, often viewed as a hedge, because they're viewed as limited supply, potentially deflationary. You've had some interesting comments around, we've had Paul Tudor Jones, people like this have popularized the thesis that Bitcoin is an inflation hedge. Now, inflation, it's hedged because of limited supply, but you've raised some interesting questions around the potential velocity impact of Bitcoin, and how that could potentially, is it as a deflationary as people think this asset class?
Well, yeah, exactly. Because how much of Bitcoin is sort of currently stored in highly immobile kind of reserves, and obviously the thing about Bitcoin is that it is effectively at its base a full reserve system, right? And and that means that unlike in the conventional banking sector, if you're just sitting on your reserves at the bank, you've got your deposits in the bank. Hey, I've got millions of dollars. They're probably being recycled through the financial system. They're always mobile, like you're not using them, the bank is taking a risk on, like nowadays, obviously post GFC, we have much stricter regulations in terms of how much of that liability they can effectively kind of recycle. But I think fundamentally there is recycling going on, right? Whereas in Bitcoin there isn't, and that's not necessarily. I mean, there is a sort of emerging bottom-up organic sort of recycling, in that we have all this, DeFi and people are putting their assets to work just to generate a yield in their own way, and it's kind of coming into Bitcoin regardless. But the base, fundamentally, if you choose not to engage in DeFi or whatever, the default isn't that your money is being recycled. So that means in an inflation period, you've got all these potentially immobile, sort of stagnant pools of Bitcoin that might suddenly be mobilized, and that the system hasn't really accounted for. Like they have and they haven't, because we don't really know how many of those stagnant wallets are forever stagnant because people have lost their keys, or they're just sitting on the sidelines, and that is quite hard to analyze, I think, as well. So you have like all these potential claims that could suddenly be mobilized, and if they do, that's an inflationary effect, because there's suddenly a lot more claimable money in the system than you might have appreciated before, if that makes sense.
I think it's a point that it's not discussed much, but very interesting. I mean, you've also talked a lot about, you've been somewhat critical in the past, I guess, about the definition of ESG assets, and obviously ESG has been one of the classic FUDs in the Bitcoin market. What's your broader view on how you think how that applies to Bitcoin, or even how maybe that narrative has evolved in Bitcoin?
So obviously, from an ESG, like from a very simplistic ESG perspective, Bitcoin is a no-go area because of its huge energy footprint, right? But ESG isn't just the E, there's also the S and the G. And
exactly.
So there's a bit of a conflict there. One other area where this conflict manifests, for example, is in the solar panel manufacturing world, right? So on one hand, we should be investing in solar because it's going to be renewable and satisfies E. But now it transpires that like 90% of solar panel parts inputs are basically made in the Uyghur country in China, potentially with very uncouth labor practices, right? Well, that doesn't satisfy S or G. So then, so which one is it, and how do you offset? And I think that's the kind of simplistic problem that ESG is going to come into more and more, because I think the more E, the more it's going to repress the S and G in some areas. So Bitcoin is at the front line of that conflict, I think, because it does, as we discussed earlier, potentially provide a tool for repressed people like the Uyghurs to help defend themselves against authoritarianism, right? And I think that is going to be a conflict.
Very much. I mean, the devil's clear in detail. You can't summarize these things. As you say, one letter doesn't summarize the whole story.
Yeah. And also, I think even on the E, I'm kind of, it's very easy to bash Bitcoin on the energy front, and superficially, obviously, it does have this horrific energy footprint. But I do think there is a false equivalence, because what is worth spending energy on and is a very subjective perspective. We learned this through the pandemic in terms of one man's non-essential activity is another man's essential activity. And I think when some third party comes in sort of dictating, well, this is essential and this isn't, and you have a right to spend energy on this but not on that, and doesn't question like how spurious other sort of activities are, and how there are other sort of energy wasting practices that are at the same time undermining the S and G, right? So I would say, huge data farms that like support monopolistic, corporates that are effectively undermining worker rights and all that sort of stuff. Well, they're great. Maybe they may be better than Bitcoin on E, but are they better? I don't think we're looking at it from the full perspective. I think we're being a bit knee-jerk about it. And the other thing about Bitcoin that I'm not, I haven't thought this out properly, and I'm sure lots of people, and I always welcome criticism. I'm just putting ideas out there, but I do feel like there is a part of the energy story where Bitcoin creates a sort of incentive, a much better incentive, to create solutions to the carbon emissions problem, because energy is such a premium in that market. The innovation there already has been quite amazing in terms of how they are adapting to create the cheapest, cleanest energy, much more so than in the conventional market. So it just shows you, if you throw money at the problem, often that is going to give you a solution much better than like a tax or something like the carrot is equally powerful to the stick, is what I'm trying to say.
That makes sense. I mean, Bitcoin's success has been about incentives. So there's no question, I think, thinking about those incentives, instead of getting away from does this have any purpose? So if you spend anything on it, it's a bad thing, because it doesn't have a purpose, which seems to be the main point of criticism. I agree. Are you incentivizing, the use of flaring from the petrochemical industry, or you're incentivizing that potentially trapped renewable energy? I mean, there's huge opportunities to change that narrative. One other thing that I think you've spoken about before in the past, I'd love to get your thoughts on, is privacy and Bitcoin. I mean, going back to the whole question of Uyghurs. I mean, how do you see these two things balancing out? And
well, I guess, look, I am still incredibly critical of the cryptocurrency sort of ecosystem, so to speak. I think it's incredibly partial to manipulation and fraud. It takes advantage of people who are being quite naive. It's very hard to differentiate anything that has, true value, not value. I mean, it's so subjective in that world, and so many pump and dump schemes, right? We have to be incredibly vigilant. But if I was to put any pro crypto hat on, it would have to be the Bitcoin maximalist one, because I think that makes more sense to me. Of course, in an open market, you can't stop duplicates and all these. That's fine. That's an open market. But I think Bitcoin does have this amazing advantage of being the first one, and logically, the system won't really work. I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's a competing market for different reputations. And at the moment, the Bitcoin reputation is the incumbent first entrant. And I think that really matters and makes a big difference. What was the question again? You were talking about privacy, right? So yeah. On privacy, I am very disappointed as a result, because I think, because I kind of more identify with the maximalist perspective, I do think a lot of the, and I understand why the community would sort of make these concessions, because it's about growing the ecosystem, and sometimes you have to go backwards to go forwards, right? And to get established, and to, make a name for themselves and grow the market and make it a fundamental force to be reckoned with. But to achieve that, I do think they've backtracked on a lot of the original vision of Bitcoin, amongst other things, the censorship resistance side of it, and the fact that, KYC, AML, every Bitcoin is just another flavor of the fiat system in many ways, because it's capitulated to all those requirements. And I totally understand, it's not to say I don't agree with KYC, AML. I think it is, I'm having issues with it. I'm not convinced it's actually solving the problem it's wanting to solve. But I agree with, I think Ian Grigg has written about this, and I agree with him a little bit, that we're being slightly deflected by the whole KYC, AML side of things, that it's a solution to all the entrenched corruption and criminal. The reality is, in my opinion, core criminals can get around KYC and AML, and the fundamental problem in the system is corruption, not visibility. I think anonymity doesn't necessarily mean bad practice, right? And when you look at, obviously Alphaville and the FT has put, one of our biggest stories in the last few years has been Wirecard, which is a really great example of a legitimate, fiat world fintech that proved to be a massive fraud, right? And it was through the corruption side of it, and on the surface of things, it was totally in line with KYC and AML, right? So I think it's much more complicated than that, and I am disappointed that there isn't more commitment. I understand why, but I'm disappointed that there's not a lot more. I would want more kind of privacy proofing in the system at this point. And I know that's hard because you can't be compliant with the system and maintain the level of privacy that Bitcoin originally had. So I see the market bifurcating. You'll have the kind of the cleared and sort of, white Bitcoin world, and then you'll have the black market, non-verified, and the two will probably coexist. And as it is currently with the dollar market, it'll be really hard to transfer in and out of it. And that's the way the system wants it. And I think our arguments have to sort of focus on really addressing whether this approach to encouraging best practice in transactions is actually the right one, because I don't see in the last 10 years, as we've intensified all these practices, has it actually improved anything? I don't think it has. I think it's actually made things worse, and the way to solve the problem is with respect to reconfiguring something in the incentive side of things, rather than this top-down kind of like effectively very, anti-privacy campaign against people, because I don't think that's constructive.
I think that's a fantastic insight. I mean, yes, the market's being forced to do this, but has it addressed anything in the existing financial system is the core question. And why should it be any better? Yeah.
Well, because you lose the argument. Like, I have often made the case that Bitcoin, was sponsoring, really bad, transactions, and in my kind of more critical, and I don't, it's not that I renege on that. I think the criticisms and my analysis was correct. It's just I now realize that that is probably not the best approach to solving the problem in the system is corruption, right? That is my revelation, right? And corruption is like the garbage in, garbage out problem, right? If you know someone who has the power to implement a account, on your behalf, it doesn't matter if KYC AML is there, because they just pretend they've seen it, and that is the point. It is impossible to regulate unless you solve the corruption problem. So you've got to address why is there corruption there in the first place. I
totally agree. I mean, we're a little bit short on time, but
sorry.
Given the theme that this line of reasoning, I'd love to just get one final question about how what your views are on CBDC and where that's going.
So I think it's been quite interesting because there was the Nigerian central bank has now issued its NERA, and we can now. I'm very kind of cynical about CBDCs. I'm not sure what problem it's solving. I don't see how it's very different to the conventional system. I think a lot of it is PR, and I think having analysed the most recent sort of Nigerian system, I really struggle to see how it's different. The only different thing is that it creates a full reserve system for the fiat world on the payment side of things. So really, I think it's misbranded. I think the biggest innovation or transformation that comes with CBDCs isn't the digitization of money. It isn't like that it introduces or makes it easier to access the banking sector, because in Nigeria, you still have to have a prevailing bank account, or it doesn't facilitate, because of the privacy access paradox. The central bank still has to take your name. So, and that means as soon as you are evaluating on a sort of standard basis, then you have to have non-accessibility, because you have to have the right to decline people, which inadvertently creates an inclusion problem. So I don't see how that's different. So fundamentally, I just think it's a shift from a low reserve system to a full reserve system. And that is a completely different argument economically. And no one is talking about that argument. Everyone is talking about the digitization. And they're also talking about, if they are talking about the problems, they're talking about how, and I agree with this, that it can crowd out the banks. But at the moment in, say, Nigeria and most flavors of CBDC, they are seeing, they want to limit the amount of CBDC you can hold on any account, right? So that kind of limits the crowding out stuff. So it looks increasingly like it's not a proper, the real reason you want a CBDC is in a crisis GFC situation where you can actually withdraw from the banking system and put all your money with no cap in a fiat government account effectively, right? That's what you want. But you can't do that with CBDC because they're going to cap it at like £1,000 or whatever. So useless on that front as well.
I'm sure we could spend another half hour talking about just about CBDC because I think there's a lot to go there. What happens to velocity? What happens to privacy? I mean, this is, we're out of time. So
sadly,
Izabella,
thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been great to have you. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for your time. Anything else you'd like to wrap up with before we go?
No, I think, watch this space. There's some interesting things coming up in my personal life and in the next few months. Okay. So get in touch if you want to know more. I am in the sort of transition point, let's just say.
Watch the space, as you said. Thanks again for coming.
Okay.
So our next METACO Talks will be in 2 weeks. Until then, wishing you a great weekend and stay informed at metaco.com/talks. Thanks.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.